We invited Julie to come in to talk about her new book, The Power of All, because it talks about the shifting the dominant culture that we've all been raised with. And how do we shift that culture and have people think about their role within their power and then the role of others. So we're super excited to have her here. Karen, we're excited to have you. Nice to see you. David, nice to have you in. Gisela, we're seeing lots of friendly folks to Catalyst. So Jeru was going to do the official introduction, but she's stuck in a board meeting. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce Julie Battilana. She is a wonderful colleague and friend. She's at Harvard Business School. She has been working on power issues for a long time. It's part of her passion project. And of course, she absolutely loves working with social entrepreneurs. Over the years, she's done a lot of research with social entrepreneurs. So this two-part workshop is this week and then next Tuesday. And then we love it if you can come to both sessions, but we understand if time conflicts are an issue. The book, if you have not received a copy of the book, let us know, and we will share the links for the copies of the books. Anybody that logged in probably in the last 24 hours, we probably did not share the book. So let's all say a big hello to Julie and put in the chat, where are you calling from? And what is your biggest issue with power? And that's a big question, maybe I should say. Give a couple word expressions of challenges you've had with power. That would be a fun introduction. So David's coming in from London, Haluk's coming in from Greece. And the kids have loads of power. I love that. Yes, my kid has loads of power. Bernard from Germany, what are any issues or thoughts you have on power? I know for me, power has been an issue from my career early on, when I thought that men and women were created equally all throughout college, and came out of college. Actually did my senior capstone on power and thought we were all sitting equal in the classroom. And this is 30 some years ago, but realized that that was not the case. So Gisela, my biggest issue with power is when it's not used for the common good. Love that. Too much power and in the 1% and not the rest of folks in the 99%. So keep sharing issues you have with power, and I will let Julie take over. So thank you once again, Julie, for joining Catalyst. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for this warm welcome and introduction. And thank you all for joining today. I know how busy this time is, and I'm delighted to see some of you who I know, and it's great to see you again. And I am delighted to get to meet others who I do not know, but I've been following your work, and it's a real pleasure to connect. So as Debbie mentioned, the Tiziana Cachorio, my dear friend and co-author, and myself published in the fall a book that's indeed entitled Power for All. And what I'd like to do with the session today, and the session we'll be having next week, I know some of you will be joining both of them, some of you will be joining just one of them, but what I'd like to be able to be doing is use the content of that book and the work I've been doing on the dynamics of change to actually talk with you about power itself, the fundamentals of power, and how to become more effective change makers. Now, before I do so, I have some good news and some bad news to share. I'm going to start with the bad news. The bad news is that although some of you may be secretly hoping that this French accent of mine is going to somehow disappear or weaken over the course of the next hour or so, I have to report that the French accent, it looks like it's here to stay. I've been in Boston, now in the US, for the past 15 years, more than 15 years, in fact, and here we are stuck with the accent. But all the work I've been doing over the past 20 years has been focused on this critical question of politics of change in organizations and in society. And I've been working with social change makers, trying to help them become even more effective change makers in everything that they do. So why is it that I think it is so important to focus on power today, and why now? And a number of your comments in the chat actually echo what I'm going to talk about. Over the past 2 years, we've obviously all been experiencing a tragic healthcare crisis related to the pandemic. But I think it's also clear to all of us, and it's so clear in all the work that you guys are doing, that the crisis we've been experiencing is not only a healthcare crisis, it's also a social and economic crisis. that's characterized by rising inequalities. You were talking about it in some of the comments, on top of an environmental crisis that has been ongoing for a long time. And I know that a number of you are working on innovations that are meant to address those different crises. Now, if we think about the roots of this multidimensional crisis, then I would say that we have to account for the role of neoliberalism, a doctrine that has really focused all of our attention, energy, on maximizing on one dimension, financial value, or, I should say, to simplify, that's all about maximizing profit within companies. Now, we know from research in social sciences, in economics, and in sociology, and we know from our experience too, that this exclusive focus on financial value maximization has been associated with increased levels of inequality and environmental destruction. So we know one thing, which is if we stay the course, what will happen is that we will further increase inequalities and we will further destroy the planet. And if this is what we do, everyone will lose. Obviously, the people who are power disadvantaged, who've been losing for some time, will continue to lose, but the people at the top will also lose because we all live on the same planet. And because when levels of inequality became too extreme, we also know from our experience and from research that then communities and societies become less healthy, they actually become less safe, and they also become less productive. So you may be having a large slice of the pie if you're at the top of that hierarchy, but it's literally shrinking. So now it's a moment in time where I would say more than ever, what we need is the work you're doing, the incredibly important work of social innovators and social change makers like you. But for that work to have impact, what is ultimately needed is power. Because what is power? Power is the ability of an individual or a group of individuals to influence other people's behavior. And as you know from your work, if you don't have power, you're not able to actually implement the important innovations that you've been working on. You're not able to put those innovations and implement them at scale. Now, the question then becomes, but what makes people powerful, right? If we want to be more effective change makers. And actually, those are questions I want to ask you now. So let's use the chat. And here are the two questions. Let's start with question one. Here is what I want to hear from you. What people come to your mind when you think about power? And please use the chat. I just want you to share with me the people coming to your mind when you think about power. Let's wait to see some of what you're going to be sharing in the chat. CEOs of multinationals, Nina, thank you. Who else is coming to your mind? Money, wealth, capital, politicians, government leaders. Yes. Josh, Natasha, thank you. Jen, land ownership. Yes, politicians, indeed. Anyone else coming to your mind as you're thinking about power? Okay, but you need the 1%, the fossil fuel industry and all the actors in the fossil fuel industries. Now, let's turn to the second question, the monarchs, thank you. If you think about all of these people you've been thinking about, what made or what is making them powerful? And you started answering some of those about that question because I saw some of the wealth, money, violence, but so other key things, knowledge, Luis, yeah, thank you. What else is making them powerful? What are you thinking about when you're thinking about them? Making deals behind the door, capital. What else do you think is making them powerful? Money, media attention. Yes. What else? Any other things that you think are making these people powerful? As you're thinking about Davos, indeed, that's kind of platform and conferences, the ability to influence. So thank you so much. I've been asking these questions over the past now 20 years to a lot of people from all walks of life. Like one of the privileges that I have through the work that I do is that I get to work with people from across the world, not only on campus at Harvard University where I work, but really across the world when I travel for research and advising. Like I've had the opportunity to work with very, very diverse groups of people. And having asked these questions to many, many different people, I've actually come to worry about some of the answers that I got from a number of people. Why? Because I got to realize that a lot of people have deep misconceptions in mind about power that actually prevent them from understanding power for what it is. And many of you may not have any of those misconceptions in mind. What I can tell you based on my work, the research and advising has done, is that a lot of the people you're working with have some of these misconceptions in mind. And if you want to be more effective when it comes to unleashing the potential of your social enterprises, of your organizations, of your movement, you have to be able to help people debunk these misconceptions. And so what are the misconceptions? The first misconception that I've come to realize people often have in mind about power is this idea that power is a possession. So they come to someone like me and they say, Julie, you study power, you've been advising people on the dynamics of change, the political dynamics. So what's the least? And I was initially very surprised by the question of what's the least? What least do you want? In fact, the least people want is that people want to know what personal characteristics make people powerful. They're kind of convinced that it has to be a mix of traits and that you have them or you don't, but they want to know if they have them or not. And so for some people, they think it's about charisma. For others, they think it's about good looks, but they want to know the magic recipe of traits that make people powerful. The second misconception that people often have in mind about power is this idea that power is only for the people at the top, that it's only for the CEOs, for the top executives, that it's only for the presidents, that it's only for the prime ministers, for the generals. And then the third misconception that I would say is probably the most widespread, and especially I have to tell you of a misconception I've seen among the community of social change makers, especially the more junior ones with whom I'm sure you're working within your organizations as well. There is this idea that power is dirty. So people would come to me and putting these things together, they would say, power may not be for me because I don't have the personality traits and I'm not one of the people at the top, but good for me because at least I'm not getting my hands dirty. And it's something I worry with some of the social change makers I'm working with, because that last misconception is often an obstacle to them because they care about addressing some of the thorniest social and environmental problems we're facing. They have amazing solutions, but they kind of do not want to have to engage with the dirty side of it, which for them is power. Now, I've come to worry a lot about these misconceptions for two reasons. The first reason has to do with the implications for all of us individually. When we do not understand power, that can only lead to frustration because then we want to have impact and we're unable to have impact because we simply don't understand how we can really influence others. But the implications are worrisome not only for us individually, but for all of us collectively, because if there are such misunderstandings about power, then how can we possibly collectively get organized to identify, to prevent, and to stop power abuses when they emerge and when they threaten our freedoms and well-being? As you all know, this is the 15th year in a row that democracy has been declining across the globe. So this is something that we obviously have to pay attention to, and that is worrisome. Now, this is worrisome, but there is good news. And what's the good news that I want to share? What I do see in my work is that when people understand power dynamics, they become much more effective leaders and much more effective change makers. And power dynamics can be learned. And this is the reason why Tiziana and I wrote that book, Power for All, with the objective of trying to equip people with all the tools they need to become more effective change makers and have the kind of impact they aspire to at a moment in time when we so need that work to be done, which is the core of the work that I know you're all doing. So now, this leaves us with a question though, right? Where does power come from? And you started addressing that question in your comments. You were highlighting some of the sources of power that the people you were thinking about had, but I'd like to hear more. Where does power come from? Based on your experience, you all have a great deal of experience when it comes to fighting power hierarchies, to mobilizing power to make change happen in a given social sector. So what have you learned yourself? What would you say? Where does power come from? And so please, raise your hand, unmute yourself. I'd love to hear from you. So what, in your experience, where does power come from? Gisela, because I see you and I know you, I feel like going to you so that you can get us started. So what would you say based on your experience? Where does power come from? It's so good to see you, by the way.
I don't know. I think we made the list in the chat, and where is the beginning of it is a matter of maybe of strength. If you look at the beginning of mankind, those people more strong, the stronger ones would beat the weaker ones and dominate everybody, and then the weaker ones would learn ways to to find other ways of power. I don't know. So and now the word's very, very, very much complex. I think we've mentioned that there is the economic power, and the economic power dictates maybe the way the political power is used, and then we have someone said about the influence, that our capacity to influence the other people. I mean, I think we all have power. I think the first thing I would say about all these things, I have power, and maybe the starting point for having more power maybe is to acknowledge the power I have. And,
so you're sort of saying we all have power. It's a matter of acknowledging and understanding where it comes from.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Because where it comes from and how I use it, and because the way I use it gets me more power or less power as well. I mean, so I think it's a very complex, and actually, Julie, I'm here because I really do not know how to deal with. I know how to deal with my power, but I don't know how to deal with others' power, you know. And all the relations.
Thank you, Gisela. And in fact, you know, when I asked you the question, it's interesting because you went back to the history of mankind. And I'm about to make a big statement. I want to share with you the fundamentals of power. I want to hear from more of you, though, before I do that. But Gisela, based on what you were saying, I'm willing to sign a document now and make a big statement saying that the fundamentals of power are the same today as they were thousands of years ago, as human beings were getting organized to live together on this planet. And I'm willing to say that they will remain the same for as long as there will be human beings on this planet, assuming that we get our act together and we do not destroy our planet. So now, what is this that we need to understand, as you said, Gisela, to sort of assess the power we have in a given situation? And I see a number of comments there. Baron, do you want to elaborate on, you talked about inheritance, and then that's echoing, then Nina is going into the structural inequalities. You want to say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I like what Gisela said. I think it's true, everyone has power, but the question is in which circumstances you are becoming into that. I mean, as a child, some people inherit it, like North Korea. If you look at the leader, he just inherits his power. He just becomes successor of his father. But also, if you look in other societies, I mean, so you have gangs where people are like ruthless and brutal and forming power, but you have also politicians. They also make and that is really a different area. Like the question is how you use the power you have. If you stand up or you're not willing to stand up, but I think everyone can. So a nice form of power, and where it. So that's my understanding of power. So you have different areas with different powers. And we talk in our area. I think we try to influence people with influence. So you also have a power. You form opinions, and you try to lead the people in the direction that they see that we have a huge climate crisis in front of us, and try this power.
Thank you. Kavita, you talked about from collectives, from morality and lack of it. Can you elaborate on that? Can you share more with us? Because that's also one of the threads I see in the comments.
Yeah, so I think power comes when you are more than one, when you are many together, and that helps getting power. When I kind of think about power, it's often because we don't question the social order. It's sort of accepted that this is how it's going to be. People who, some people are going to take decisions, we will follow. There's a sort of an acceptance of that, unfortunately, and that's. But I also think that people have moral power, and some people have lack of morality because they think it's okay to pick up a gun and shoot somebody else, and that kind of gives them power. So I think that's what my third piece was.
Yeah, you're right. That if you think about it, if power is the ability to influence other people, it can be done through persuasion or through coercion and the use of violence. So you're absolutely right to highlight those critical things. So here is what I want to share with you: the fundamentals of power that. As I said, I'd be willing to send that document saying they've been the same and will remain the same. So here it is. Power resides in control over access to valued resources. And this is a critical and simple principle that you need to be aware of and that you need to make others on your team aware of. But let me give life to it, right? What do I mean by it? So basically, I have power over you if I control access to resources that you need and want. Right. And you have power over me in the meantime, if you control access to resources that I need and want. Let me give you an example. It could be that you control access to a budget that I need to be able to complete the project I'm working on. And if so, you have some power over me. Now, in the meantime, it could be that I'm connected to one person who's an expert in a domain that's tightly connected to your project, and that you absolutely need to connect with that person. And if I happen to be the only person who's connected to that critical person, at least the only person you know who's connected to that critical person, then I certainly also have some power over you, right? So now, why is this important? This is critical because when you understand the fundamentals of power, you are then able to debunk the fallacies about power that I just mentioned. Now, let me share with you a story. This is one of the stories we use in the book. It's connected to our Catalyst 2030 community. It's the story of Nezuma and Jube, and some of you may know Nezuma. Nezuma lives in Tanzania in a remote rural area. And I vividly remember that the first time I talked to Nezuma, Tiziana and I, in the process of writing this book, we knew that we would be relying on our own research and all of the research produced in the various fields of social sciences on power that we wanted to make available to people who do not necessarily read that research. But we also wanted to use stories to give life to everything we had learned about power. And so we interviewed more than 100 people across the world, and Nezuma is one of the people we interviewed for the book, and her story is in the book. And so when we first interviewed Nezuma, she shared with us that her dream as she was growing up in her rural community in Tanzania was to become a teacher. She could never go to school. And when we talked about her power, she looked at me in the eyes and she said, well, listen, Julie, I never felt I had much power. In fact, for a very long time in my life, I felt quite powerless. And she explained everything and said, listen, the key decisions in my village are made by the village council. And for the longest time, we didn't have a single woman who was actually part of that village council. And though Nezuma's life radically changed in 2016, she went from, as she said to me, feeling quite powerless, and objectively, as she also said, being quite powerless in her community, to becoming one of the most powerful people in the community. In fact, so powerful that she was asked to join the village council and became the first woman to actually sit on that village council, which she was very proud of, because as she said, she could represent the interest of women in the community. Now, how did that happen? I'm sure many of you here are familiar with Barefoot College, one of the organizations that's part of Catalyst 2030. So in 2016, Barefoot College went to Nezuma's community and they explained that they were looking for a volunteer who would come and study with them to become a solar engineer. And then if that person would go through the whole training, that person would come back with all the necessary materials to electrify the community. The members of the village council thought it was a great opportunity. And when Barefoot College asked for volunteers, men raised their hand. And that's when Barefoot College explained that it would have to be a woman. And that's when Nezuma raised her hand. Her husband initially didn't want her to go, but the combination of the members of the village council working together with the representative of Barefoot College, like that group of people managed to convince him to let Nezuma go and study. And so for 5 months, she studied to become a solar engineer. The program at Barefoot College, as you know, is actually based on peer-to-peer learning and like learning by doing, using different kinds of color codes. And so after 5 months, Nezuma came back to the community and she electrified the village. So she didn't only literally bring power to the community, but in doing that, she also became one of the most powerful people in the community because she controlled access to electricity, a resource that everyone needed and wanted. Now, this is a critical thing, right? Let's go back to the fundamentals of power, right? The thing is that when you understand that power resides in control over access to valued resources, in Nezuma's case, electricity, then you become able to analyze the balance of power in any relationship, in any of the relationships that you have, that your organization has, that different countries have, I would also say. So what is it that you need to pay attention to, right? We said it, you have to be thinking about, in any relationship, your power and the power of the other party, right? Remember that you have power over someone if you control access to a resource they need and want, but they also have power over you if they control access to a resource that you need and want. So what questions do you have to ask yourself? Well, the first question is, do I have something that the other party needs and wants? Right. Now, the second question, though, is wait, but do they have alternatives to access these resources? Like, put yourself in the shoes of Nezuma. If you're learning to become a solar engineer and you're coming back to a community that's already completely electrified, well, yes, you know how to electrify, but electricity is already out there and people have many alternatives. So you do not have much power. But if you're the only provider in the community, then you have much power. But you cannot stop there. To analyze the balance of power in any relationship, you also have to account for the power of the other party, right? Do they have something that you want? And then, by the way, do you have alternatives to access what they have to offer to you? Right. So I want here to actually insist on one thing that came out of the comments you shared in the chat. And that's a critical thing that we were all actually discussing with Kavita, and that's related to the comment she made that about morality. Material resources, land, money, you talked about them in your comments. You're absolutely right. They can be resources that we value, and they can be great sources of power in many different situations. But we human beings do not only value material resources, we also value psychological resources like achievement, affiliation, status, autonomy, and yes, Kavita, you're absolutely right, morality. Right? So those can obviously also be sources of power. And if you think about the iconic change makers like MLK, Martin, so like think about Mandela, think about Gandhi, think about more recently Malala Yousafzai and Greta Thunberg. Like, what is it that they have in common? They're standing for moral values that some of us want to be associated with, and that gives them a great deal of power, right? So again, power resides in control over access to valued resources, but these resources can also be psychological ones. Now, why is it that I wanted to walk you through these questions that you have to ask yourself? Well, I wanted to do that because that would enable you to analyze the balance of power in any kind of relationships. But once you understand those critical questions as components of power, you can also identify the strategies you have at your disposal to try and change the balance of power in any relationships. And this is so core and central to the work that many of you are doing. You're all about trying to change existing unjust power hierarchies and redistribute power. And to do that, you have to be clear about the strategies you have at your disposal. So now let's talk about that together. Just thinking about what we just discussed about, like the different components of power and the questions you have to ask yourself. Now, what would you say are the strategies you have at your disposal to rebalance, to change the balance of power in a given relationship? What are the strategies? And think about your own experience. You have so much experience doing these things yourself, but then what are the strategies you have at your disposal to rebalance power, to change those power dynamics? Feel free to chat, to unmute yourself. What are those strategies? Again, it's so core to what you do. So how are you thinking about the strategies you can use to tackle those unjust power hierarchies?
Julie, I think I have a prior question because I have lots of difficulty in understanding what the others value.
Aha, that's an excellent question, Gisela. So it's a difficult, because you're absolutely right that, you saw Jordan comments, and Jordan, thank you for that comment when you said, like, what's a source of power? It's knowledge about power. It's being able to map power and read power in any relationship. And this is very true. In fact, this is what research is showing, that a critical source of power is the ability to read power relationship. And so, Gisela, this is related to your point, because then there are two questions to ask yourself, right? In any situation, what do people value, and who controls access to what they value? That really flows from the fundamentals of power. If you can answer these two questions, then you're able to read power in any situation. Now, the first question of what do people value, this is in chapter 3 of the book. It's a difficult question to answer. I am with you, Gisela. It's a very difficult one. So what have we learned from the past centuries of, like thinking, writing, research on the drivers of human behavior? What we explain in the book is that there are two universal needs that we human beings share: a need for safety and a need for self-esteem, right? So as you're trying to understand what people need and want, You can always go back to the need for safety and the need for self-esteem. The reality, though, is that we all pursue these needs in very different ways, through material resources, through different kinds of psychological resources. So Gisela, this is a critical thing, which is you cannot assume that your needs and wants are the same as others, as we all know. And so you have to take the time to inquire, to get to understand what it is that they truly need and want. Now, you can rely on observation for that. And when it comes to the people you're working closely with, what I would say is you need to build the trust so that you get to understand what they need and want, so that you can then empower them, right? And so that first question is critical. What do people need and want? And then there's the critical question of who controls access to these resources that people need and want, because those are the powerful people. But a given balance of power can change. And so the reason why I highlighted those 4 components, the resource they value, their alternative, the resource you value, your alternatives, is because then that gives you an idea in terms of you actually have 4 strategies you can use to rebalance power in any kind of relationships. And here is what these strategies are. The first thing you can do is try and convince the other party that what you have to offer to them is so much more important than what they ever thought, right? That's an attraction strategy. That's what marketing professionals are doing all the time. Again, you have something and you're trying to convince people that this is more important to them than they thought, right? But this is not the only strategy to rebalance power in any relationship. What can you do? You can also consolidate, right? So what do you mean by it? Well, you can try to reduce the number of alternatives that the other party has to you to access the resources. Think about it. This is what workers understood when they created unions, right? Let's get together to reduce the alternatives that our bosses and the owners of the factories would have when it comes to the relationship they have with us. This is also what monopolies at the other end of the spectrum are doing when they're reducing the number of options for customers. Now, the other 2 things that you can do to rebalance power in a relationship are the following ones. The other party has resources to offer. What you could do if you want to rebalance power and reduce the power they have over you is actually turn your back and just say, you know what, I don't need that resource that you have to offer anymore. I'm going to be looking for a substitute. And then the 4th thing that you can do is actually try and expand the number of alternatives you have to access the resources that this person or this organization has to offer, right? So the reason why I wanted to walk you through those fundamentals of power is so that we get a clear understanding of, yes, power resides in control over access to valued resources. But I also want to now use that knowledge to once and for all debunk the fallacies about power that we were just talking about, right? As I mentioned, a lot of people think that power somehow is a possession. But what we saw with the example of Nezuma is that no, power is never a possession. Power is always relative. Nezuma had no power in her community. She gained access to a skill that was highly needed and valued in the community, and that gave her a great deal of power. Now, as I said earlier, controlling access to electricity was a source of power in this community, but would not have been a source of power in an urban community that would have already been electrified, right? So power is never a possession, it is always relative. The other key fallacy that we cannot debunk is this idea that power is only for the people at the top. Nezuma was not one of the people at the top when she came back and electrified, though she gained a great deal of power. So power is not only for the people at the top. I would say it's potentially for all, but I want to give you one example. And I have to take you to France at least once in our conversation. So I'll take you to France for that anecdote I want to share with you. In the 1960s, a group of French researchers wanted to better understand the factors that would influence the productivity of workers on the floor of factories. And so they picked a factory, La Ceuta, that was a factory that at the time produced cigarettes. And they met with the leadership of the factory on the first day of their observation. They asked for the organizational chart of the organization. And then they went and observed what was happening on the floor of the factory for a couple of days. After a few days of observations, they asked to meet with the top leadership again. And here is what they told them. They said to them, listen, we came to the conclusion you gave us the wrong organizational chart. So as you can imagine, the leadership of the organization was quite annoyed. They didn't have multiple organizational charts. They only had one organizational chart. And so they explained that that was it. They gave the right organizational chart. But then the researchers were really puzzled. They explained that it didn't make any sense because according to the organizational chart, the workers were reporting to foremen, who were reporting to middle managers, who were reporting to top managers. And yet somehow, anytime a top manager, a middle manager, a foreman would come on the floor of the factory and ask the workers to do something, the workers seem not to care. But when maintenance workers in charge of repairing machines came to the floor of the factory and asked the workers to do something, the workers were pretty annoyed, but they immediately complied. Now, that was very puzzling because the maintenance workers were as low in the hierarchy as the workers themselves. So the most powerful people on the floor of this factory were the people who were the lowest on the organizational chart, right? They didn't have authority. Why is it that the maintenance workers were so powerful? Well, machines on the floor of that factory had a very bad tendency to break, right? And the workers were paid depending on the number of cigarettes they produced every day. So now you get to understand that the most valued resource was a machine that worked. And the maintenance workers knew that. And the reproach at the time was not really ethical. What they decided to do is that they wouldn't share any information with anyone as to how to fix the machines. And that's how, like they kept the power that they had, which was highly problematic, again, if you think about it from an ethical standpoint, but they were very aware of the power that came with that. So now why am I sharing this story? Because as we all know, the organizational chart is giving us some information about who has authority and who doesn't. But we shouldn't turn to the organizational chart if we want to understand power dynamics in an organization, or at least not only to the organizational chart. In that organizational chart, Martin Luther is the CEO, right? He has the highest level of positional power. He has the authority. What is authority? It is the formal right to give orders and commands. Now, you can be at the top and have authority, though, and have far less power than other people who are much lower in the hierarchy of the organization, right? Authority can be a source of power, but it is not a guarantee of power. And you're absolutely right, David. This is the same as a security guard and secretary in the organization. And the tech people now, we indeed absolutely control the uncertainty. They control access to the valued resources. And this is the reason why I'm sort of saying, that power is not only for the people at the top, as the anecdote of the maintenance workers shows and your example show, power is potentially for all. Now, I don't want to oversimplify. There are power hierarchies in society that enable some of us and constrain others. But again, if we understand the fundamentals of power, then we can think about how we can work together to change those power hierarchies and redistribute power. Now, the third and final misconception that I want to debunk is this idea that power is dirty, right? Which is, as I said, probably the most widespread of all of those fallacies, and something that I've heard a lot in working with a lot of the social change makers I've had the pleasure and the privilege to work with. Here's what I would say. Power itself is not dirty. Power is energy, right? It's this ability to influence others that you need to get anything done. Now, that being said, we shouldn't be naive, right? The dirtiness, if anywhere, is not really in power, it's in us. And this is why I would say that, yes, power can be dirty, but it doesn't have to be. And so bear with me here, because this is, I think, absolutely critical. What I get to see, and what you all know from your experience, we know that from history, and we know that from research in social psychology, we do know, and this is true for every one of us, including everyone in the social innovation, social enterprise community, power tends to poison us. It actually has two very insidious effects on human psychology that have been very well documented. When we are in positions of power for some time, here is what happens. We tend to become more overconfident. We tend to develop more of a sense of invincibility. This is the very well-known trap of hubris, right? And then the other thing that happens to us when we are in positions of power for some time is that the more it goes, the harder it is for us to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, to take their perspective. We become more self-centered. We start seeing the world only through our lens, and we start thinking with hubris that people are so lucky to have us because we can solve all of those issues for them. Now, these are indeed the power poisons. But what Tatiana and I explain in the book, and this is based on our research and other people's research, is that they are power antidotes. What's the antidote to hubris? The antidote to hubris is the practice of humility that requires an awareness of our impermanence. And the antidote to self-centeredness is the practice of empathy that requires an awareness of our interdependence, right? But when people practice humility and empathy, that's when they're able to really see power as a responsibility, adopt a collective orientation that's going to facilitate the pursuit of a higher purpose. Now, I so wish I could actually stop here, because I would say practice humility and empathy. But if I did, you'd be thinking I would be incredibly naive, and you'd be so right, because we're only human after all. And so I may be convinced that I'm practicing humility and empathy, but I may not be. And so I may still be at risk of actually abusing my power. And that brings me to another member of our Catalyst 2030 community who we interviewed for the book. This is Vera Cordero, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so Vera was incredibly candid and courageous when we talked about power and her relationship to power, because, as you know, Vera created Instituto Dara in Brazil, and she's dedicated her whole life to trying to save the lives of the kids who live in some of the poorest communities in Brazil and across the world. And she's developed, as you know, a multi-dimensional approach to try and solve this thorny problem. And the approach at Instituto Dara is to try and save the kids by helping not only the kids but their families. And the multidimensional approach is all about helping the families with employment issues, helping them with housing issues, helping them with education issues, with citizenship issues and healthcare issues, right? Now, Vera explained to me early on that she first had a relationship to power that was the relationship that I see in a number of the social change makers, especially the younger ones I've been working with. And it was the case for Vera when she also got started as a social change maker. She explained to me that initially she didn't want power. She wanted to have impact, but she didn't want to become one of these people who had power and were using it in dirty ways. And then she, at some point, made peace with power. She realized she needed power to have the kind of impact she wanted to help the kids and help their families. And she said that she was convinced that she would never be one of these people who would be abusing their power. But she described to me how at some point, as Instituto Dara was doing well and things were going well, she actually got to be invited at Davos, was invited to a number of gala, won a number of awards. And that's when her staff and her family confronted her. She remembered that moment when her daughter came to her and was like, why do you want to go to yet another gala dinner? Why do you want to go to yet another award ceremony? Why don't you spend more time with us? Why don't you refocus on the kids and your staff and all these things you've been wanting to do? And she said to me that when she realized she had been on an ego trip, even though she thought she would be immune to that, she had been on an ego trip. So what did she do? She doubled down on humility and empathy. And for her, it was through the practice of meditation, and it can be for others and for us other things that we would do to actually double down on humility and empathy. But she didn't stop there, and that's the critical thing. She also created processes and systems and structures in our organization to ensure power sharing and to hold those in power, including herself, accountable, which is something critical we all have to do, because we may still be at risk of abusing our power. And let me give you a simple example. What she did is that she decided that during the weekly meetings she would be organizing with her staff, she wouldn't be allowed to interrupt people. She would have to listen. She would be the last one speaking, and they would rotate the order for the other employees to make sure that everyone had some time to speak. And she asked people to hold her and hold others in power accountable to make sure they would respect those rules that they actually created together, right? So now, you can engage cleanly with power. It's about cultivating empathy and humility and welcoming and actually setting processes to share power in the organization and to hold those in power accountable. And once you do that and you understand the fundamentals of power, now you can engage cleanly with power. You know how to map the political landscape. Gisela, we were talking about those two things, right? Understanding what people need and want, and understanding who controls access to what they need and want. But what you can also do now is you can get to better understand your own sources of power, the channels that you have to access valued resources. So this is actually the question that I have for you now. Based on everything we've discussed and your own experience, what would you say are the sources of power that you have at your disposal if you want to be more effective change makers? Like, what are the ones you've been using and you're using now? And again, feel free to chat. Please unmute yourself. I want to hear from you. What are the sources of power that you have at your disposal that you've been using that have been helpful to you? You mentioned knowledge earlier, which is certainly one of them, but what are the other sources of power you have at your disposal? What are they? What would you say they are, those sources of power? Jiro, my team, family, friends. Yes, absolutely. So all of these people surrounding you, close to you. Yes, Katlega, you're sort of building up the networks and connections, networking, absolutely. The relationship around you. Eva, respect from others. Yes, the trust you're building in them, the collective vision, your position. Organizations like Catalyst 2030, absolutely, which is an interesting question for all of us to think about. How to leverage Catalyst 2030 so that it can help accelerate the changes you're implementing and give you more sources of power. Right.
And that's actually a question that I have, Julie, is with Catalyst, is that thinking about the power dynamics that we have and how do we rebalance the power with our stakeholders, and specifically thinking about, funding systems, et cetera. But what are some thoughts regarding that? Because it's a much bigger ecosystem.
Absolutely, Debbie. And in fact, so this is connected to what we have now on that slide. That was you actually talked about all the sources of power. We all have three main sources of power at our disposal, and it's also the case for Catalyst 2030. We have personal sources of power that are based on our individual attributes and skills, such as your knowledge, level of expertise, level of effort you put into something, your leadership skills, your charisma. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about you as change makers and your leadership skills. We also have positional sources of power that are based on the formal roles we hold in an organization or in society. You talked about the position in your comments to me earlier. And then we have relational sources of power that are based on the relationships that we have with others. And so I think an interesting question to think about for Catalyst 2030, and Debbie, I wouldn't sort of be here saying, oh, I have all the answers, that you're asking a difficult question that I know you guys have been thinking a lot about, and I've been part of some of the brainstorming, but is to think about how Catalyst can empower its members through one channel being, right, enhancing their personal, positional, and relational sources of power, right? And helping them think about how Catalyst can do that. Are there, like, Catalyst is doing a number of things to enhance the personal, positional, relational sources of power of its members, but are there other things it's not yet doing that it could be doing? And you're talking about funding. Yes, it's one of the channels. So you could be thinking about, could Catalyst do more in terms of connecting people to the funders and giving them the knowledge that they need on the personal side so that they can go and do that kind of work? And is there a world in which Catalyst, through the ecosystem it's creating, can create certain roles that are going to bring more visibility to some of the people and the organizations and the network that's going to enable them to do more of their work? But my hope is that the framework I've been sharing with you and now these sources of power can help you as tools think about what else we could do. And I think it's a two-way conversation, like among all of us, which is what is it that we can do for Catalyst and what is it that Catalyst can do for us, and how can we use that work to help advance the important work that all the members are doing in relation to different issues. But Debbie, what do you think? Oh, you are on mute, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that's, I think Giroux's been really good about kind of leading everyone in terms of that, building the relational power. But I also think sometimes we feel like it's going too slow, because we want to shift the funding system now. And there's a lot of things actually that are coming up in the General Assembly next week that are talking about shifting the funding dynamics, which is super cool.
Yeah, you're right. And I think the difficulty there is that, and this is something that we absolutely all have to acknowledge, Debbie, it's related to the fact that we want things to happen and we want them to happen faster. but all of the changes that the people in the community are talking about are changes that I would refer to as really divergent changes. They break with the norms, right? As you said, it's about let's change the pattern of fundings and donations. So you're not just saying let's change and it's an incremental change. You're sort of saying let's change. And we do realize that what we're talking about is about going against and deeply entrenched power hierarchies and norms associated with these power hierarchies. And so the question becomes, okay, but how do we do that? And this is why I think that what you've all done, like following the leadership of Jiro, when we're all doing as part of the Catalyst 2030 community is so critical, because we individually or even within our own organizations may not have all the sources of power we need to make the kind of change you're talking about, Debbie, happen, right? Changing the funding ecosystem. But by joining forces with others, and that was so clear to Jiro in the theory of change of Catalyst 2030, then we can significantly expand the pool of resources we have access to. And that's when maybe we can accelerate the kind of change that you're talking about, which is exactly what the power of collective action is in organizations and in society. Now, here's what I'd like to say, though. Like the reason why I'm so excited about Catalyst 2030 is because I'm convinced it's bringing together all of the movements, organizations, communities we need to try and help a society for tomorrow that's going to be fairer, more democratic, and greener. Now, we should acknowledge, though, that we continue to face massive power imbalances and inequalities that came out of your comments early on. You're absolutely right. The existing power hierarchies, talk about sexism, talk about racism, talk about other forms of inequalities, are still deeply, deeply entrenched. And the gap between the 1% and others, if anything, has been increasing during the pandemic. So these power imbalances are absolutely still there. But if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that what we human beings created, we can together change, right? And what this requires from us is obviously agitation, because we need people to be out there and bring others' attention to the fact that the status quo is not tolerable. But what I've learned from my research and the work I've done with social changemakers is that agitation alone is not enough. We also need to innovate and orchestrate. And this is, I think, where Catalyst is so critically important, because Catalyst can help accelerate all of those things and amplify the agitation, the innovation, and the orchestration. So as you're thinking about how to mobilize the resources, I'd be thinking about how to do that when it comes to agitation, innovation, and orchestration to help solve the problems that we're all trying to tackle. And when I say that agitation is not enough, I want to bring you back to the Occupy Wall Street movement. What a great deal of highly effective agitation, right? You could say, and it was highly needed. Now, that being said, it brought everyone's attention to the situation, but the movement then sort of slowly died. And why did that happen in such a way? It's happened in such a way because there was no real alternative at that point in time where we could turn to and say, okay, here is a set of alternatives. This is how we could reorganize our economic system and our social system. And this is what I think is very different today. What I think is that today we have not only the agitation related to this multidimensional crisis we've all been experiencing, but thanks to communities and movements like Catalyst 2030, and thanks to the amazing work you've all been doing, we have the innovations. You've been the innovators, you've been implementing them, and we know that they're working. And so now it's a matter of orchestrating and making them happen at scale, which is, I know, what also Catalyst is meant to do and has been working to do. So what do I mean by agitating, innovating, orchestrating? For those of you who are not familiar with that framework, the agitators are the ones who speak out against the status quo. They raise public awareness of the problem. Think about Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, and all the young people. This is exactly what they've been doing. But agitation alone is not enough, because agitation without any kind of innovation is actually a set of complaints without a way forward. You also need innovators like you who develop the actionable solutions to address the grievances of the agitators. And we also need the orchestrators, and there are many among you as well, who enable the coordination of the parties involved so that the changes can be implemented at scale, right? And so this is what we all need to think about. What roles can we play through Catalyst and beyond to be effective agitators, innovators, and orchestrators, which is something we develop in the book in detail in chapter 6 of the book, and that I'll spend more time talking about during the session we're going to be having next week for those of you who will be able to join. Now, I want to conclude here because I want to make sure I leave some time for questions that you may have. And I know it's also a very busy day. So if you have to go, I want to make sure you're able to go. But I hope you now better understand why we decided to entitle this book Power for All. Because I would say that power can and must be for all. Why? Because everybody can grasp the inner workings of power once you expose them to the fundamentals of power. And some of you might already have been clear about these dynamics. And I hope that the book itself and what I shared can help you help others by enabling them to better understand the inner workings of power. The second thing is that everybody can gain a measure of power. And why do I say that? I say that because once you understand the fundamentals of power, then you get to understand the strategies you have to rebalance power in any kind of relationship. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but what I'm saying though is that if we pool resources together, we can change the existing power hierarchies, which to me is exactly what Catalyst 2030 is about. And that's why I'm so excited about it. And then the last point I want to make is I'm saying that power can and must be for all, because we obviously need to understand, build, and use our power individually and collectively as citizens to make sure that power continues to be shared and that those in power are held accountable. And this is true for us within our own organizations, and it's true at the level of society. And this is the core of our democratic societies, but we have to be very careful because, you know, power has to be shared and we had to hold those in power accountable. But, you know, it doesn't take much time, as we know, to someone to even be elected democratically and then abuse their power and create a dictatorship. So that's all I wanted to share with you. And you have access to the book itself, but just wanted to see if you have any questions, anything else you'd like for us to discuss. If so, delighted to take your questions now and continue the conversation. But I'm mindful of everyone's time. Oh, Vera, it's great to see you. I had not yet seen you, so good. I'm so glad, Vera, I get to see you like twice over the course of a few days. Reactions, questions, things you want to debate and discuss together. And for those of you who will be joining next week, what I'm going to do is then use this in-depth analysis of power and sources of power to talk about you as change makers. And we'll be looking at how you can leverage your personal, positional, relational sources of power to be ever more effective in the changes you implement.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Julie. This is absolutely inspiring, amazing, and I'm going to bring it to so many of our defenders, and they will be inspired too. So thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
amazing.
Thank you so much.
Julie, sorry, I came later in your speech today, but I just want to share that it was an honor for me to be interviewed by Julie and to share, you know, my concern regarding power, because I think power is crucial. And the book is wonderful. I think everybody has to read the book. And I was very lucky to be interviewed by Julie. Thank you so much, Julie.
Well, Vera, I'm the one, you know, like who's grateful. Like I learned a ton from you through those interviews, through what you shared with the students last week. So thank you. We really, with all my gratitude.
Thanks, Julie. It was very inspiring. I really like to listen to this. And it would be an interesting thought how we can use in Catalyst 2030 this power to influence and get our SDGs really forward. And people that have the power in politics or wherever are get influenced positively.
Thank you, Bernard. You're right. I think that the question you asked, Debbie and Jerry, we've had those conversations. This is critical. How do we think about what Catalyst 2030 could do? Like it's already doing a lot, but to further amplify what you're doing and basically increase the pool of resources and the sources of power that you all have at your disposal. That can happen through the putting everything together, but then are there more things that we should all do to put that on steroids and enable us to do what Debbie was talking about, which is making some of those really difficult divergent changes happen faster?
Yeah, I agree. And then there's the Future for Friday you mentioned. I mean, it took a while, but they have now a voice and a very strong voice. And hopefully we will getting there as well.
Absolutely. And I see Mauricio. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we have Marissa? Could you talk about that? Because I think you bring up some really good points. Marissa, are you able to unmute and join in?
I'm sorry, is that me?
Yes, that is you.
Oh.
I know. Sorry, Mauricio. Mauricio.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I thought yeah.
You're killing your name, sorry.
No, I just want to bring it up that I'd love to have some discussions in terms of the power that we in the helping sector hold, because it just fits so much of the definitions that were put out here, that we probably are the ones that have access to resources that the families don't. Not as much access as we want, which is a lot of the discussion. We want more of our own access. But the families that, well, where I grew up and whatever, they are fully aware of the power dynamics and that they themselves really don't hold that much. I think even talking about empowering families is sort of backwards. I think they hold power. They're the only ones that know their own community. My mother is the only one that knew how my sister and I would react to anything. So they're really, their information, they're the only experts of their own lives. And somehow or other, we have to learn how to follow that expertise. So just to have that discussion here or in other places would be great. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with you, Mauricio. So you're raising a critical issue that I think we have to be thinking about, which is a critical one for all of us in that space. What's the power that we have? How are we using it? What are we learning from others? And
Right.
Importantly, I think that's the core of what you're saying, Mauricio, which is how do we empower then the families to do what's going to be most helpful to them when they are the ones knowing the best? And what does it mean to do that? You know, in writing that book, I was myself inspired by Toni Morrison, who always told her students, if you have any power, then your job is to go and empower somebody else. If you're free, your job is to sort of free someone else and go and empower these people. And I see that as being at the core of what you all do. But I agree with you that there's always a lot we can learn about how can we do that in a truly liberating way? How can we do that by empowering people in the way that's going to be most helpful and effective to them? And I think it's a difficult but really important question that we have to spend more time thinking about. And I think we can learn a lot from each other in that community about how to do that effectively.
Yeah, very true. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vera, I hate to put you on the spot, Vera, but I think what you talked about with us about the communities that you work in and how you empower them to make decisions for themselves. I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but if you can just share a little bit about how intentional that that your organization has worked with people in the communities to lift them out of poverty.
You're talking with me, Vera?
Yes, Vera.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. You know, can you repeat, please, again? Because you talk about the community, the people we serve, not the staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're working with us, you have so many different steps to empower the person that you're working with. Yes. To explain the model.
As we work among the poor, the poorest people that came from the hospital, public hospital in Brazil. They have lack of everything: house, food, education, and so on. And so I believe, you know, this connection among people, two people. So no matter if they are volunteers from Instituto Dara or if they are staff, they start to establish a very deep conversation with each member of the family. Normally, they're responsible for the family. Women, Black women in Brazil, they are the poorest. So through the deep conversation about feeling, how they are feeling, how are they to understanding their lives. I joke that we are like Obama. Yes, you can. But when they arrive, they're so depressed with children with cancer, no money for food, for education. But then through the relationship with the staff and the volunteers, for example, just to give an example, there was a mother has problem with a child that used drugs. And then the volunteer said, I have the same problem. The volunteer who served the family, my son used drugs. And the mother was so comfortable to know that another woman being that was serving her, that was supposed to have more power than her, she was able to, you know, to show her weakness, her family problem. So the family start to believe in themselves and then to empower and then change their lives. I don't know if I was clear, but I gave an example that I still remember.
You are, and Debbie, I was with you as I was sort of discussing with Mauricio. I was your interventions were on my mind as to what you've learned about how to truly empower the families you're working with. It's sort of leading me to think about as well for us with a movement like Catalyst 2030 is that, if power is about control over access to valued resources, and the two questions is, what do people value and who controls access to the valued resources? The truth is that we should ask those questions in any situation to understand the power dynamics and help the people we work with ask those questions so that they can be more effective. But then we can also think about those questions at a higher level, which is what do we as a society value? And who do we think should control access to the valued resources? And this is where I see Catalyst 2030 as being also a movement that can help shape the narrative and the norms in terms of what do we value? Like, enough of valuing only financial performance. We should be valuing also, like the creation of social and environmental value. And then who controls? Enough of power concentration. Let's think about how we truly empower others, which is related to the conversation between we're having with Vera, Debbie, and Mauricio now.
Thanks a million, really. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and I look
appreciated.
forward to seeing some of you for the next one. And if not, we'll get to stay in touch. And take very good care, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks,
Julie. Thanks.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you so much, Julie.
Thanks. Big hug.
So good to see you. Take very good care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.